Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to learn about how to make a TableView controller, and we'll use our restaurants as our data source. We're going to create a new Xcode project, and I think we can make do with just a single view app. Let's call this the restaurant TableView App. Pretty inspired name. Create that. Let Xcode do its thing. Let's go to the storyboard first. Do y'all need a moment? On the storyboard, I'm going to delete this view controller that they gave me and get back to a blank storyboard. And I would like to bring in a TableView controller and drop it here. Furthermore, I would really like that TableView controller to be in a navigation controller because that's better. Well, I want to be able to navigate with this. So I'm going to go, while clicking on it, I'm going to say Editor, Embed in Navigation Controller. So that'll create this nav controller to the left containing the table view. And lastly, if you build this, it won't work because it'll run, but you won't see anything because there's no initial view controller. You remember this? I deleted the one that had the little gray arrow pointing to it. So I need to click on this nav controller and come over here and click is initial view controller. That'll bring the arrow back. As Paul points out nicely in the videos, there's two kinds of cells that you can use. If you have static content that you want to put in the cells, like if you just want to use a table view controller as kind of a container that always has 3 rows that always have the same things in them, you can create what are called, wait for it, what are called static cells. Here we go. Clicking on the table view, you see I've got dynamic prototypes or static cells. So in static cells, whatever I type in is what would appear. If we want to actually have a dynamic data set that populates the cells, then we need dynamic prototypes. So in these static cells, I could just click in here and I could drag a label in and put this label here, and it would say, you know, I heart Taco Bell. And when I run this, I should get a table view that has 3 cells, and the first one says I heart Taco Bell, and the other 2 don't have anything. Yeah. Sometimes when you have this static content that never changes, this is an easier way to do it than to go through all of the protocols and delegation that we're about to jump into. This was something that wasn't in iOS when I started developing a couple versions ago, and it was annoying when you had something that was like this. You know what I'm saying? Because then you had to implement all this extra stuff just to do this simple thing. So I like this for those cases. But this isn't what we're going to spend our time on. We're going to pretend like we have a dynamic data set, even though it's really dummy data that's static. So I'm going to click back on the table view here and change it from static cells to dynamic prototypes. And I am going to delete this label that I added. We're using a TableView controller, which is a built-in class that has a table view in it, and that's its whole view. And it's already set up. Everything's connected up so that the custom class that will be behind this, be connected with this, is going to be the data source and the delegate for this table view. In order for us to code that, we need to add in our custom class that does that. So I'm going to come over here, say File, New, File, and then under iOS Source, I want a Cocoa Touch class, and I need this to be a subclass of a UITableViewController. And typically we call this whatever our thing is, TableView Controller. So since we're dealing with restaurants, we'll call it the Restaurant TableView Controller. We'll say next, create that there. Now in this case, because there are all these protocols that UITableView controllers are supposed to implement, Xcode gives us a bunch of boilerplate code to fill in. And it's nice because you pretty much have to do most of these. And it comments out a lot as well. You see all this that you get. But this is a really good help. I'm not going to delete this code this time. I want to use most of it. Back to my storyboard though, I want to make sure I do this. You know how often we talk about this. You got to link these together by clicking on the TableView controller and then setting its class to be the Restaurant TableView Controller. Otherwise, it won't be connected with the code that we're about to write in this other file. So now that I've made that, I can come back to this Restaurant TableView Controller. So to start off with, I want to show you how to set there to be a number of sections and rows in the table. These two functions are super important. So if we want to statically say there are 4 sections in this table and each section has 10 rows, we could do that right there by just changing those numbers from 0 and 0 to 4 and 10. Now inside each of those, there's not going to be anything because we haven't told it how to add content to that. So this is the third function that we have to implement, the cell for row and index path. I'm going to uncomment it and then configure this cell. So again, we already looked at collection views, and this is similar to collection views, how we're going to dequeue a reusable cell object and then set the stuff that's specific to our program. By default, you get a cell that has, I think it has a title label, and it may have an image in it as well. There's several different pre-configured cell designs, and then you can customize it yourself. So what we're going to do is we're just going to say cell dot, I think it's called text label dot text, and we're going to set this equal to a restaurant name. And we're going to do this for every single restaurant. So what we should end up with is a table view that has 4 sections, and each section has 10 rows, and every row will say a restaurant name in it. Does that make sense? Or the app could crash because we forgot to do something really important. I did that on purpose. Notice how it's choosing a cell. It's choosing a cell based on this string. That's the reuse identifier. So this is the kind of cell that we want to reuse. So this reuse identifier has to match what's in our storyboard. If we go back to our storyboard and click on this prototype cell, you'll notice there is no reuse identifier. If this is the one I want to use, which is fine, then let me just put something in here like restaurant. Or even restaurant cell. Seems a little clearer. I'm going to copy that. This is another one of those times where we're dependent on the strings being exactly equal, or we get bad runtime errors. We'll go back to the restaurant TableView controller, and I'm going to replace the string reuse identifier with restaurant cell. So now it's going to try to get that blank prototype cell as the kind of object that it's going to reuse every time. I think now it's going to work. Yes. So what we have here is 40 cells. I know it's terrible, but we have these 40 cells. We can't tell where the sections are. The reason for that is we haven't told it how to write a section header. How do we put in a section header? Well, closing that and coming back to here, there's a function that we have to override in the, I think it's the data source. I'm pretty sure it's the data source protocol. And you can get it by beginning to type this in, override func and then table view. And I like to scroll down here until you can kind of see what the different functions are there defined. for the table view, and the one we want is title for header in section, this one. So this function is going to take in an integer representing the section number, and we're going to return the title for that section. If we had different things, we might want to look them up in an array, if we had an array of section titles. In this case, I'm just going to return a string that is section and then the section number, just so you can see it. So it should say section 0, section 1, section 2, section 3 as these little section headers that'll stick to the top when you're in that section. Let me show you. You've seen this in iOS. It's a common thing to have these. So you see the section header there and how it sticks to the top until I get to the next section. So you get all this functionality for free. I think that's kind of cool. We're not going to do it today, but you do have stylistic control over all this stuff, and you could customize this view if you wanted to that is the sections. All right, well, this is still really terrible because we just put static data in here. Let's connect these to our restaurant data set. So I would like to find that restaurant, those particular classes. I would like to drag in the data set and the restaurant classes that we wrote before and drop them here. I'm going to say copy items if needed to make sure that there's a duplicate of the file that's in this project and it's not linked back to these other files that are a different project on my computer. And that's what I just emailed you. So if you now open up, now you should have the data set and restaurant in your code. So what we're going to do is create an array, okay, var restaurants, and it equals the dataset dot dummy dataset. So this array here will be an array of restaurants, and that's the data that we can use to drive our to populate our TableView controller. So down here, we'll still leave it with four sections and let it repeat just so the table view is really long. But for the number of rows in each section, if we're going to get the data from the data set, then the number of rows needs to be bound, connected to, right, correlated with how many things are in our array, how many restaurants we have. So that's going to be restaurants.count. I'm going to delete this warning. Does that make sense? So there will be as many rows as there are restaurants in the array. And then in here, instead of saying a restaurant name, I want to get out the restaurant that's at the index that this row is at. So I'm going to say restaurants at, notice I get passed in the index path. An index path is a section number and a row number. So I need to get the index path dot row. So the thing that's in the third row, or the row equals 3, I'm going to get that restaurant equals 3 out of the array and show it in here. So I'm going to say dot row, the index path dot row dot name, which is the name of the restaurant. Am I doing something wrong? Okay. So let's see if this works. Just those two quick fixes, you see that we have the right number of the right count of restaurants in each section, and we're getting their name out because that's what's in the restaurant. The table view is a scroll view, like we talked about last time. So it's a subclass of a scroll view, so it has this scrolling ability. And there's the reason, the way that that's implemented is through inheritance. Notice that I can select these things, and it changes the color to this gray, but it doesn't do anything. A very common pattern, which I think is present in a lot of your apps, I think your projects, is to click on this, and then you see some more details about that row. So let me show you how you could do that, since it's such a common pattern. I'm going to go, well, before I do that, any questions about what I've done up to this point? Okay, let's go back to the storyboard, and I would like to make it so that when you click on one of those cells, it brings you to a new view controller that shows you the name and the logo, say, of that restaurant, to get some more details about that. So I'm going to come down here and drag out a new view controller right here next to it. I can control drag from this cell to here to set up my segue. So when you select one of those cells, we're going to show this view controller, which doesn't have anything on it. I'd like it to have a label with the name of the restaurant and an image view with the logo of the restaurant. Make sense? So I'm going to drag over the label, put it up here, and I will give it some vertical spacing to the top layout guide and some leading spacing, and I will give it some trailing spacing as well. I'll let this logo be as wide as it wants to be, and update the frames. Hang on. Did that really put in a yes? Trailing space equal to 518. I don't want that. I'm going to change this to a trailing space equal to 0. Okay. So this is going to show the name of the restaurant. I would also like for there to be an image view, which I will put right underneath here. And I generally like it to just take up the rest of the space. So I'm going to give I'm control dragging there. I'm going to give it some vertical spacing to there, some leading spacing, some trailing spacing, and some vertical spacing to top bottom layout. And one other thing I'm going to do is instead of doing scale to fill, I'm going to do aspect fit for this image so that it doesn't change the aspect ratio of the image and squash it or whatever. I'm going to stick to whatever the dimensions of the image are so it looks good. All right, in order to use these things, I need outlets for them and I need a view controller. I don't have a view controller for them, so I should make one. So File, New, File, Cocoa Touch class. I want this to be a subclass of a UITableViewController. What do you want to call it? The Restaurant Details View Controller? Yes, yes, beautiful. And this Restaurant Details View Controller, I need to connect as the custom class for this view controller, like so. Remember this step? So this view controller is a Restaurant Details View Controller. I'm going to go into this Assistant Editor mode because that's the easiest way to drag. It's still difficult. And I'm going to drag over, control drag the label over here to get an outlet, call it the name label. And I'll drag over the image view and have a logo image view property. So now I can program with the name label and the logo image view. Does that make sense? What I'm going to do is assume, I need one more thing. This Restaurant Details View Controller is going to show a restaurant based on a property, which I'm going to call the selected restaurant, which is of type restaurant, and it's optional. So that way it can be nil. What we're going to do is set that selected restaurant before we load this view controller, and when we load it, then we'll load the name and the logo. But I'm expecting to have a restaurant object here. So on view did load, I'm going to check and say if restaurant equals, actually no, I don't have to do that. Hang on. I'm going to say that let me just say that the name label dot text equals the selected restaurant dot name. Now we've put the segue in here. See it right here? If we run this, it's not going to work though. Let's run it and see what happens. Nothing. Why is that? Now we got to pass the data in. That selected restaurant has to get set, and where do we want to set that property of the restaurant details view controller? That's right, when we're preparing to segue. So that's such a common thing that that function is already down here in the TableView controller. See this function? Prepare for segue. So the two objects that get passed into this function are the segue and the sender. The sender in this case should be a UITableView cell, whichever cell you clicked on. And the segue is an object that represents this connection from one view controller to another view controller. So let me show you the right way to do this. And this is largely taken from Paul's lecture because you know he does things safely, which now you know there's going to be a lot of if-lets and curly braces. So this is what we'd like to do. First, every segue has an identifier. And if we're going to be good, then we should give this segue an identifier. It's possible to have multiple segues coming off of the same view controller. We only have one, so we wouldn't really have to do this, but this is the right way to do it. So let me show you the right way. So this segue should have an identifier. So we could call it maybe show restaurant details. You like that? Is that okay name? So this is the show restaurant details segue. So I've given it a name on the storyboard, this segue object. So now in our prepare for segue, we're going to only run the code that we're about to write if the identifier is this show restaurant details. So I'm going to say if let identifier which is just a constant I'm setting here. If identifier equals if let identifier equals segue dot identifier. Then I'm going to write a switch case on the identifier. Now switches in Swift are like switches in other in C-based languages where you have case colon and then list out the particular different cases that you're expecting, but you have to put a default case which will run if nothing else is caught. So it'll make sure switch cases have to be exhausted in Swift. So the only case we should have is the case, case show restaurant details. So if the identifier of the segue is show restaurant details, then what we need to do is figure out which cell they clicked on, figure out which row that is, figure out which restaurant object that is in the array of restaurants, and pass that restaurant into the restaurant details view controller that's about to be shown as its selected restaurant. So first I'm going to figure out which cell was clicked on by saying let cell equals sender as UITableView cell. It's passed in as any object. I need it to be a UITableView cell. Then I'm going to look up the index path for that cell by saying if let index path equals, and there's a method on the table view called TableView dot index path for cell, and you pass in a cell. So if I can find an index path using this cell object, then I can figure out what the row is, and we know that the row of the cell is the same as the index of the restaurant in the restaurants array, because that's how we structure our data. And usually you structure it like this, where those indexes are equivalent. There should be some mapping. So now I want to get the destination view controller from the segue object. So I'm going to say if, well, I don't need an if here, I think. I'm going to let VC be the view controller that I'm passing to, or that I'm segueing to. So VC equals segue dot destination view controller, and I need to do this as a restaurant details view controller. If I don't do it as this data type, then it won't have, the compiler won't know that it has a selected restaurant member property. And then lastly, I know this was a lot of work to get here, I finally just say VC, which is the view controller that we're going to, VC dot selected restaurant equals whichever restaurant from the array of restaurants is at index path dot row. Okay. And then lastly, remember I said that switches have to be exhaustive, so I can have a default statement here that'll catch anything else, and I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to break. So I know that was a lot of work for a seemingly simple thing, which is passing data in to a details view when you select the cell. So let's see if that worked. Sweet, it says Taco Bell. We're not using that logo yet. Ah, McDonald's. Feels good, doesn't it? This is a satisfying day. So, do y'all have any questions or comments or ideas on this process?